Senator Di Natale.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. This bill, the bill introduced by Senator Wilson, who I have to say is leading the charge in informing the Australian community and indeed protecting the Australian community from the impact of secret trade deals negotiated without the scrutiny of the Australian Parliament. It goes to the heart of what the role of governments should be and what the roles of corporations should be in our community. The language in this area is very dense, it's very technical. ISDS sounds like it's a term well, it's used deliberately so that most people don't understand what the implications of this is. It's very simple. It's simply about whether corporations should have the right to sue governments about the decisions that they make. Should a corporation have the right to sue a government if a government makes a decision that affects their bottom line? That's what this is about. It's very straightforward, and it's a fundamental question. It's a fundamental question. What is the role of government? Should it be that corporations rather than governments are able to introduce penalties to governments because they make laws that are in the public interest, but by consequence of those laws impact on the bottom line of those corporations? It goes straight to the heart of what government should do. Now, I take the Churchillian view, which is that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. I would much rather that democratically elected governments make decisions on behalf of the community rather than corporations, whose primary responsibility is to make a profit and to ensure that shareholders get a return. And that's effectively what's at stake here. Now, that's not to say, of course, when you get into these debates, you get into these polar corners, you end up with people who support trade deals and people who don't. I'm not anti-trade. I think international trade is a good thing. I think international trade is a tool, if used properly, that can lift people out of poverty. International trade, foreign aid together are very, very powerful tools to lift the living standards of developing countries and developed countries. But it can't just be free trade, it also has to be fair trade. Those two things need to go together. And again, reducing tariffs can be a good thing. In fact, it has been a good thing here in Australia across many industries, enabling us to be a much more competitive, open economy. But this isn't some divine rule that's been handed down from a tablet above. It's always interesting that it's those industries often that have benefited from protection from government that have been able to grow and become strong that are the greatest proponents of free and fair trade. Trade is a tool here, it is not an outcome. What these provisions represent is basically a right for companies to make a government go before a local court or a specially arbitrated international tribunal if it believes it's breached the terms of a trade deal. That is, if the company or investor is successful, governments are held liable, financially liable, for the losses that that company incurs. And it's so pervasive that it cuts across all tiers of government. This isn't just a question for federal government, it's a question for state governments, it's a question for local governments. The great shame here, and we've heard this time and time again, is that there's no transparency in this process. These deals are being negotiated in secret and that the community don't understand them. Look, it's a very technical area, and it's only after a number of briefings that I've come to understand just how wide, far-reaching, pervasive some of these terms are. We heard from the other side that, well, actually Australia's not really going to be caught up in this. There have been very few investor-state dispute provisions targeting Australia. Well, let's not forget there are over 550 claims made against government over the past 10 years. There have already been 550 disputes made against government over the past 10 years. And Australia's got 28 agreements that we've signed on to that include these provisions. Deals with countries like China, India, Peru, Chile, Singapore and so on. I think there's one situation that I want to focus on specifically because it highlights just how dangerous these investor-state dispute provisions are, and it's the issue of plain packaging. We now know that Philip Morris is suing Australia under an ISDS provision in a Hong Kong-Australia investment agreement. What they're doing is they're challenging some of the most significant public health measures introduced by any parliament, that is our plain packaging legislation introduced by the previous government with the strong support of the Greens to try and reduce people taking up smoking. But under the 1993 agreement between the Government of Australia and the Government of Hong Kong for the promotion and protection of investments, it's called the Hong Kong Agreement, we've seen a claim being brought against Australia. It's the first one that's been brought against Australia. I guarantee if we sign on to this TPP with the ISDS provisions that we've heard about, it won't be the last. Now, Philip Morris's, it's their Asia division, they claim that Australia's tobacco plain packaging regime constitute a breach of an agreement, all right? And that agreement is that there's fair and equitable treatment to Philip Morris Asia's investments. They're asserting that the plain packaging legislation constitutes an unreasonable and discriminatory measure and that their investments have been deprived of full protection and security. That's exactly the point. This is one of the only products that we've got that if it's used according to the manufacturer's instructions, it will kill you. So the Australian government, as it's done over successive years, has taken an important measure to try and reduce smoking rates. It's what the community expect of us. And yet here we have a multinational company taking action against an Australian government because its profits are under threat. That's what this debate is about. What we've got is the Australian government making laws. They're good laws. They're laws that save people's lives. And yet what we have is an undemocratic entity taking action against a sovereign nation because of a threat to its investment. And the question, of course, is where does this stop? Where does it stop? We now know that there are questions around the pharmaceutical benefits scheme in this agreement and access to affordable medicines. What about food regulation and food safety? Let me focus on one specific area, and it's the area of a new class of drugs that we call biological drugs. In the rules that we know are being discussed just this week, there are negotiations around the use of biological drugs that will, if implemented, delay access to affordable cancer treatments, to new vaccines, and increase the cost of pharmaceutical benefits listed medication to Australian consumers. Now, these biological drugs, all right, there are about 64 of them now listed on the PBS. There are going to be many, many, many more to come. It's a very exciting area of research. Cancer drugs, medicines for conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, other vaccines. Very difficult to make. The manufacture of these biological drugs is technically very, very complex. And so it means that they're expensive. And what actually happens is during the period when the company makes the drug, it gets a monopoly because of the very nature of the production process of the drug. You can't simply copy it in the same way as you copy other medications. And what actually happens is that we have a process called data exclusivity. Let me try and unpack that a bit. For any drug that's made, that drug gets 5 years of something called data exclusivity. What that means is if you're a generic company and you want to copy someone else's drug, the trials that were done by the originator drug can't be used for a minimum period of 5 years. It's an added layer of protection to the company that's innovating, that's making the drug. It says, if you want to copy this drug, it's going to be 5 years before you can use our results. Now, normally with generic drugs, the way our system works is they don't have to repeat the clinical trials that are done by the originator drug. In 5 years' time, they get access to that data. That's called data exclusivity. It's an added layer of protection to patent laws. Now, under a proposal under this agreement, there's a plan to extend that data exclusivity. The US wants 12 years data exclusivity. That means, should a drug be manufactured, a biological drug to treat cancer or rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, that it will be an additional 7 years before a competitor can come along and say, we can make this drug, but we can make it for a lot cheaper. It's going to cost the taxpayer a lot less. That's 7 years that we deprive entry into this market from a competitor. These are the champions of free trade, the champions of free trade. We love competition. We love it. We love it so much that we're going to stop competition for 7 years for another entrant into the market. That's what the US want right now. In Australia, we have a 5-year period. The US wants 12. What are we going to get? We don't know. We simply don't know, because these deals are being negotiated in secret. I just think it's a great irony here. I mean, competition's great. It's wonderful. It's the engine to a productive economy, unless you're a corporation who wants to use patent law, who wants to evergreen, who wants to use data exclusivity to prevent the entrant of a competitor. Then we don't like it. Then we don't like it. So we've got a situation at the moment where this is very much an issue that is being discussed. We've got a pharmaceutical patents review panel that has said very explicitly that there aren't any examples that indicate that the current protection systems aren't sufficient enough to provide protection for innovator companies. At this stage, and I quote, the Pharmaceutical Patents Review Panel, at this stage the case has not been made to extend data protection for biologics in Australia. We don't know what's going to happen. We may find it goes to 8 years, as I think Japan are currently talking about, or 12 years, as is the case in other countries. So this is a huge issue, a huge issue. Let me give you an example. A particular drug, the drug's marketed as Lucentis. It's an injectable antibody. It treats macular degeneration, stops people from going blind. And it was a drug with the third highest cost to government in 2013. It cost Australian taxpayers $286.9 million in total. Now, when the first biosimilar drug comes onto the market, that is a generic competitor, you'll get a 16% statutory price reduction. And what you'll get is a saving to the taxpayer of $45 million in the first year, with a whole lot more flow-on effects from price disclosure in subsequent years. Huge saving. So here we have on the one hand a government running around like Chicken Little talking about how unsustainable the health system is. We've got to introduce co-payments. We've got to make medicines more expensive. Well, you're right. You are making them more expensive through these trade deals. That's what they are doing. I mean, if you're so concerned about the costs of medications, the cost of the PBS, why would you sign on to a trade deal that is going to prevent the entry of cheaper generic drugs into the market? That is what we're dealing with right now. Look, there are so many other areas in this agreement, so many that we could talk about. We've heard about, from my colleague, Senator Rachel Seward, the issue of a whole range of environmental disputes. We've got the disputes in Canada, where investors are challenging measures introduced on a whole range of environmental grounds. We've got Pine Resources in Quebec. They had a moratorium on hydraulic fracturing there. It meant the company lost their gas exploration permit, dispute going on there. We've got a moratorium on offshore wind farms in Ontario, right? Silly decision by that government. Their decision to make. Democratically elected, they want a moratorium, they should be able to do it, even if I disagree with it. But then what we get is we're told that the ban is a breach in the contract for electricity supply with the Ontario Power Authority for a 20-year period, another dispute. We've got Oceania Gold, an Australian company. They've got a subsidiary in El Salvador suing the government for more than $300 million. Why? Because the government refused to grant a gold mining permit. They're being sued because they knocked back a permit for a gold mine. We've got in Sweden, we've got a Swedish energy company that's fielded a request for arbitration against Germany. Again, because the government made a decision, in this case I think a good one, to phase out nuclear power. So here we have situation after situation, democratically elected governments making decisions, usually good ones, sometimes bad ones, being challenged by hugely profitable multinational corporations because they affect their profits. We've got to decide. We have to decide. Who is it that should be making decisions on behalf of the public interest? Who is it? Democratically elected governments or corporations? I know who I'd decide. And then you have to ask the question, what's it all for? What is it all for? Productivity Commission in 2010. The Commission, and this is a quote from the Commission, the Commission received no feedback from Australian businesses or industry associations indicating that ISDS provisions were of much value or importance to them. A direct quote. Another quote. There does not appear to be an underlying economic problem that necessitates the inclusion of ISDS provisions within these agreements. So here we've got our government behind closed doors, talking to a range of countries, introducing these secret provisions that nobody wants, not even Australian business, that will have an impact on a whole range of vital sectors. Making decisions around plain packaging, making decisions about the costs of medicines, making decisions about whether a mine should be approved or not, making decisions about the sort of energy supply we have in this country. Who do we want to be making those decisions? Well, I know who I want. I want the people that I go to once every few years, mark a little number next to their name. I want them to be accountable. I want to know that if they get it wrong, that I can go back in a few years and boot them out. I don't want some faceless person whose only obligation is to return a profit and he's not accountable to the people that he's taking action against. I commend Senator Whish-Wilson's legislation. I think it's important. I think it's an important issue, and I think it's about time we started recognising that it's governments and not corporations that should be legislating on behalf of the public interest.